Picture this. It's 2026. Gas is robbery, eggs are a luxury item, and you're cruising down the highway at 70 miles an hour in your perfectly reliable Japanese car. Maybe it's a Civic, maybe it's a Camry, maybe it's a Tacoma you've babied for a decade. The light ahead turns red. You press the brake pedal like you have 10,000 times before. And suddenly the entire steering wheel starts violently shaking in your hands. The dashboard rattles. The whole front end of the car feels like it's trying to tear itself apart. Your heart drops. You think the car is dying. You limp it into the nearest Western dealership the next morning, and a guy in a clean polo shirt with a clipboard walks out, gives you that pitying little nod, and delivers the verdict. Your rotors are warped from heat. You need a complete front brake job. Rotors, pads, labor. The quote prints out and it says $600, maybe $7. Maybe in 2026 inflation it says $900. And you nod, because what choice do you have? You're scared. The car was shaking. Safety first. You pay. You drive away. And what you don't know, what you will never be told by that dealership in a million years, is that you just got robbed in broad daylight. Because the real fix for that violent shaking steering wheel costs $5. $5. A single tube of high-temperature silicone caliper grease and about 20 minutes of work. That's it. The massive, thick forged steel rotors they just threw in a recycling bin, they were never warped. They couldn't warp. The physics doesn't support it, and every master mechanic in Japan knows it. The dealerships making billions off your brake jobs want you to think replacing rotors is the only safe option. It isn't. It's basic metallurgical friction. But as always, I'm sharing this for educational purposes, as a matter of historical observation about how cars actually work, so you can have an informed conversation with whoever services your vehicle. Let me explain the engineering, because once you understand this, you'll never get scammed again. Japanese brake rotors, especially on Hondas, Toyotas, Mazdas, Subarus, are made from forged or high-grade cast iron with very specific carbon content. We're talking about a slab of metal that, on most sedans, weighs between 15 and 25 pounds per rotor. To actually warp that metal, to literally bend it out of true, you would need to bring it to a temperature somewhere above 1200 degrees Fahrenheit and then quench it unevenly. That doesn't happen on a grocery run. That doesn't even happen towing a trailer up a mountain pass. The brake fluid in your car boils at around 450 degrees on a bad day. If your rotors were actually hot enough to warp, your brake fluid would have already turned to vapor and you'd have no pedal at all. So the warped rotor diagnosis is, in 95% of cases, a mathematical impossibility. Yet it's the #1 diagnosis written on repair orders in this country. Why? Because it's the easiest, most profitable lie in the entire service industry. Now here's where Japanese engineering gets interesting. Almost every modern Japanese car uses what's called a floating caliper design. Unlike the old-school fixed calipers with pistons on both sides, a floating caliper has 1 or 2 pistons on the inside only. The caliper itself physically slides on 2 metal rods called slider pins, sometimes called guide pins. When you press the brake pedal, the piston pushes the inner pad against the rotor, and the reaction force pulls the entire caliper body inward, dragging the outer pad against the rotor from the other side. It's elegant, it's cheap to manufacture, it works flawlessly, but it only works if those slider pins can actually slide, and there is the entire scam in one sentence. If you're tired of mechanics throwing away perfectly good steel rotors that don't need to be replaced, hit the like button right now, because every single like makes this video harder for the dealership lobby to suppress in the algorithm. And tell me in the comments how much a mechanic charged you the last time your steering wheel was shaking on the highway. I'm collecting these numbers. I want to see the average extortion price across America in 2026. So, back to the scam. The villain in this story is a man in a clean uniform handing you a quote for $600 to fix a problem that costs $5. Let's walk through exactly how this Stealership playbook works. You bring the car in. The service writer drives it around the block, feels the shutter, comes back inside, and types into the system. They never even pull the wheels off. They don't inspect the caliper bracket. They don't touch the slider pins. They just write warped rotors because that's the pre-filled drop-down menu in the diagnostic software. The shop charges you for 2 new rotors at marked up dealer prices, 2 sets of pads you didn't need, 2 hours of labor, shop supplies fee, environmental disposal fee, and tax. $600 minimum. In some markets, in 2026, I'm seeing this exact job quoted at $1,100 on a Lexus. Now here's the dirty part. The technician in the back, the guy actually turning the wrench, often knows the truth. He pulls the wheel off, slides the caliper off, and he can see the seized slider pin with his own eyes. The boot is torn, the pin is rusty, it doesn't move. He could clean it, grease it, reinstall the old pads, and the car would brake perfectly. But he can't, because the work order says rotors and pads, and the shop already billed you, so the steel goes in the bin. This is what I call acoustic extortion. They use the sound and feel of the shutter, that scary vibration, to terrify you into authorizing the most expensive possible repair. Fear sells parts. Fear is the entire business model. Now, let me get into the actual science of why your car is shaking, because this is the part the warped rotor myth completely buries. There are two things happening at the molecular level. First, the slider pin failure. The slider pins live inside little tubes in the caliper bracket, and they're protected by small rubber accordion-shaped boots. Those boots, over 5 or 7 or 10 years, dry out, crack, and split. The moment that rubber tears, water and road salt and brake dust get inside, the pin starts to corrode. The factory grease, which was a thin layer of silicone paste, dries out and turns to a chalky powder. Now the pin is dry, rough, and rusted in place. The caliper can no longer float. It's locked, stuck. One pad is being mashed into the rotor with full hydraulic force. The other pad is barely touching. Second, this leads to what's called uneven pad material transfer, and this is the actual cause of the shudder. Modern brake pads are made of a composite of metals, ceramics, and a phenolic resin binder. When a stuck caliper jams one pad against a hot rotor and holds it there, even when you let off the pedal, that resin literally bakes onto the steel surface of the rotor. It cooks. It forms a thin, rock-hard deposit of carbon and iron compound called cementite. We're talking about a substance that is microscopically only a few thousandths of an inch tall, but it's harder than the rotor itself. Now, every time you brake, the pad hits that raised cementite spot, then drops, then hits it again. That's your shudder. That's your shaking steering wheel. It's not a bent rotor. It's a high spot built up from heat-fused pad material. And once you understand that, you understand the fix. The fix is so simple it's almost insulting. You jack the car up safely, both front wheels, on jack stands, never just a jack alone. You pull the front wheels, you'll see the caliper, that big metal claw hugging the rotor. On most Japanese cars, there are 2 bolts on the back of the caliper, 12 millimeter or 14 millimeter, sometimes a 17. Those are the caliper slide bolts, and they thread directly into the slider pins. You unbolt them. The caliper lifts right off the bracket. Now you can see the slider pins themselves sticking out of the bracket like 2 little metal fingers. You wiggle them. If one of them is stuck, doesn't slide smoothly in and out, or feels gritty, you found your culprit. You pull the pins all the way out. You wipe them clean with a rag, getting off all the old dried grease and rust. If the pin is pitted, you can buy a new one for about $8. If it's just dirty, perfect. Now you take your $5 tube of silicone-based high-temperature caliper grease, not regular grease, never lithium grease, never wheel-bearing grease. It must be silicone rated for brake calipers because it won't swell the rubber boots. You smear a thin, even coat all the way around the pin. You slide it back into the bracket. It should glide in like it's floating on air. You inspect the rubber boots. If one is torn, replace it for $2. You reinstall the caliper, torque the slide bolts to spec, usually around 25 foot-pounds, put the wheel back on, and you go for a test drive. Brake firmly from 40 miles per hour 3 or 4 times in a row. The pads will scrub against the rotor, the cementite high spots will be worn flat within a few miles, and the shudder you were sure was going to cost you $600 will completely vanish. So here's the warning, and I want you to hear me clearly. In 2026, with the cost of living what it is, with car repairs more expensive than they've ever been, you cannot afford to be ignorant about how floating calipers actually work. Every single time you get brakes done, whether you do it yourself or you pay a shop, those slider pins must be pulled, cleaned, and lubricated. If a mechanic ever tells you your rotors are warped without first inspecting your slider pins and your caliper movement, you walk out. You find another shop. You ask for a second opinion. Because 9 times out of 10, that warped rotor diagnosis is a $600 lie covering up a $5 maintenance step they were too lazy or too greedy to perform. Subscribe and hit the bell before the dealership lobby gets this channel shut down, because I have a whole list of these scams lined up. The oil change interval lie, the transmission flush trap, the serpentine belt fear-mongering, the cabin air filter markup. We're going through every single one. The Japanese engineers figured all of this out 40 years ago. The information is out there. You just had to know where to look. Now you know.